Something inside you feels strange, doesn't it? It's not sadness, it's not ingratitude, it's not laziness, although they try to convince you otherwise. It's as if a silent part of your being is pulling you away from the life you've built, and no one has explained why. It seems like a crisis, but it's a revelation. It seems like a collapse, but it's alignment. According to Carl Jung, before any real rebirth, the soul causes a detachment from what no longer makes sense, and the mind interprets this as failure. But it's not failure, it's spiritual survival. You are not broken. You are simply dissociating from the version of yourself that was never you. And if that sounds counterintuitive, wait until you understand why this strange emptiness you feel is, in fact, the first warning that your consciousness is trying to escape the prison of the persona. What comes next will make you see each unexplained sensation with brutal clarity. And perhaps for the first time, you will realize that you are not falling. You are returning to where you always belonged. There's a specific point in the journey when a person realizes that something inside them has begun to move without asking permission, and it's as if life itself slips a few centimeters to the side, slightly shifting out of the frame that always seemed normal. They look in the mirror and, for a second that lasts longer than it should, feel like they're observing a stranger, a silent visitor who entered through the door of consciousness without knocking. This sensation is not delirium, nor spiritual weakness. It's the beginning of a profound change. What Carl Jung said happens when the dissolving ego begins to give way to something more authentic. The person sees their routine, talks to the same people as always, fulfills the same commitments, but deep inside, a slight suspicion arises that they are living on autopilot. That current life no longer carries the symbolic weight it once did. It's almost like watching one's own day, as if following a series that no longer holds their attention. The most curious thing is that no one around notices this internal shift, and perhaps that's why the feeling becomes even more lonely. But this initial rupture, this small misalignment, is usually the exact point where the archetypal crisis awakens, bringing that uncomfortable question that no one wants to ask aloud. Is the life I lead still really mine? And when that question appears, the journey has already begun. At some point, this silent visitor, observing everything from within, begins to become more present, as if correcting its internal posture, adjusting an invisible chair, and saying, "I'll stay here for a while." And the person feels this with disconcerting clarity. Things that previously went unnoticed, the way they speak to please, the places they frequent out of obligation, the conversations where they feign interest, begin to sound artificial. The feeling of living a borrowed life intensifies, as if the true self were trapped behind a thin wall, gently knocking for someone outside to free it. Carl Jung described this moment as the beginning of individuation, when the human being begins to notice that they have spent years playing roles imposed by society, nurturing an acceptable version of themselves while stifling their deepest spirituality. If the person stops for a few minutes at the end of the day to reflect, for example, writing 3 lines about what truly made sense and what was merely repetition, they will realize that almost everything that weighs them down is what did not originate from them. And this realization, however strange, is the first sign that the old life is ceasing to match who she is becoming. It's as if an internal alarm, which had always been silent, has finally been activated. Over time, this growing existential displacement makes the person wonder if they've gone mad or are simply finally waking up. They begin to notice subtleties, phrases they say without believing, promises they keep unwillingly, commitments they accept without reflecting. Sometimes, in an ordinary moment, washing dishes, making the bed, going to work, that uncomfortable thought arises, "None of this feels like me." And it doesn't. It's the classic symptom of the collapse of the persona, the same one Jung described when the individual begins to lose attachment to their former social identity. It doesn't mean mental disorder. It means that the true self is pushing the door from the inside out. Those who go through this feel the strange impression of watching themselves live as if their body were in one place and their consciousness in another, analyzing everything with an almost spiritual coldness. For some, this manifests as a loss of enthusiasm, for others as an uncomfortable silence, and for many as a clarity they never asked for but can no longer ignore. It is precisely at this point that reality begins to become slightly blurred, giving way to something even deeper, something that the next topic reveals with precision. There's a phase on the inner journey where the world suddenly seems to lose focus, as if someone had placed a soft filter over reality. The person looks at things and perceives a kind of spiritual fog hovering over everything. And this is not illness, nor weakness, nor escapism. It's a clear symptom that something profound has begun to stir within them. Carl Jung said that when the soul begins to approach the individuation process, the external environment seems less solid because the center of gravity ceases to be the world and becomes the inner self. The person walks down the street and notices that the colors are different, conversations seem distant, sounds arrive as if from a long corridor. It's a feeling of being present and absent at the same time, as if the body were in first person, but consciousness were floating 2 steps behind. This blur is not a mistake, but an invitation. A call to realize that the life they were living on autopilot no longer accommodates the truth that is emerging. The rational mind tries to explain it, but cannot, because it is a symbolic, almost alchemical change. When this dissociation appears, it is a sign that the dissolving ego is giving way to something broader, as if the person were ceasing to see with their eyes and beginning to see with their soul. This feeling of spiritual unreality is often frightening at first. The person thinks they are losing control, but ironically, they are finally beginning to regain it. The fog appears after long periods of emotional repression, of overly burdensome social roles, of suffocating expectations, exactly the kind of scenario that initiates an archetypal crisis, according to Jung. When the soul is ignored for too long, it creates this curious effect. The external world loses strength because the internal world needs to be heard. It is common for the person to feel out of sorts, as if time has become viscous and the hours no longer have the same weight as before. They may notice this in simple moments of the day, talking to someone and realizing they are not really there, driving and feeling that their body is acting on its own, or even looking at common objects as if it were the first time. For many people, this phase seems like an involuntary request for a pause, a silent reminder that there is an inner life that has been neglected for too long. It's no coincidence that many spiritual traditions interpret this phenomenon as the beginning of an energetic detachment, the moment when the soul begins to move away from its former self, preparing the ground for the future death of the ego. The most curious thing is that this spiritual dissociation is not empty. It is full of information, only in a language that the intellect does not yet master. It's as if a second field of perception is activated. The person perceives emotions before words, intuitions before explanations. They feel the environment from the inside out, as if they could see the cracks in their own emotional reality. And this has a clear reason. When the collapse of the persona approaches, consciousness can no longer sustain the charade of appearances, and then this layer of estrangement emerges. It is the beginning of the tearing of the veil between what the person is and what they pretend to be. Some try to resist, but the more they resist, the more intense the feeling of unreality becomes, because it is precisely this that pushes the person inward, to where true transformation resides. In moments like these, simple practices help. writing down vague thoughts to understand what is trying to emerge, walking alone without music to hear the real world, or even taking small pauses during the day to notice what the body is feeling. Each micro-observation strengthens this new inner center. And as this inner fog spreads, something begins to crack within the character that has sustained the person for years, preparing the ground for what comes next, which is usually even more intense. When a person enters this phase, they realize something disconcerting. The persona they've maintained for years begins to show structural flaws. That socially functional version, molded to please, to be understood, to be predictable, begins to feel uncomfortable, like clothes that are too tight. Carl Jung described this moment as the inevitable beginning of the collapse of the persona, a point in the journey where the soul refuses to continue repeating what no longer makes sense. The person tries to respond as they always have, but feels that their voice sounds false. They try to smile where they once smiled, but now their face is heavy. You try to hide emotions, but they leak out the edges. It's as if the psychological stitching is giving way, stitch by stitch. Spirituality, when awakened, does exactly that. It challenges masks. It pushes, pressures, illuminates. And the person realizes that, however much they try to keep functioning, something inside them no longer accepts living on the surface. Small discomforts grow, empty conversations, demands from others, family expectations, obligations that no longer resonate with their heart. It's the beginning of an archetypal crisis that no one chooses, but that everyone who approaches individuation eventually faces. And as these cracks multiply, the ego tries to resist, and that's when the pressure really mounts. The crack in the persona is not an abrupt collapse. It's a gradual, almost artistic process where the soul peels away layers with a precision that only the unconscious possesses. The person notices they've become more sensitive to false environments, more intolerant of superficial conversations, more uncomfortable in relationships that depended on their nice and functional version. This change isn't selfishness, it's ego dissolving. Something that's confusing because it seems the opposite. Instead of the ego inflating, it begins to lose power, ceasing to compel the individual to fulfill roles that no longer resonate with their truth. This explains why so many people report feeling different during this phase, quieter, more serious, more selective, almost as if they were saving energy for something bigger. And they are. When the mask begins to slip, the body knows. The mind knows. Even behavior changes. It becomes more authentic, sometimes more brusque, sometimes more honest. At this stage, it's worth observing practical patterns. In which conversations do you feel you're acting? In which relationships do you need to shrink back? In what environments do you play someone you no longer recognize? These questions help visualize where the crack first opened and where it will continue to grow if ignored, because inevitably it does grow. And then comes an even more decisive moment. The person realizes they can no longer sustain the old version of themselves. The energy needed to keep the mask active becomes too much, like holding a smile for hours until your jaw aches. This is where the death of the ego begins to creep in, announcing that something internal is being dismantled piece by piece. The persona, which once seemed solid, now sounds hollow. The person tries to reproduce old behaviors, but they sound theatrical, and they feel it immediately. It's like going back to a childhood bedroom and realizing it has shrunk. Nothing fits anymore. Deep spirituality acts like an inner lantern, revealing everything that was created to please others, to avoid rejection, to guarantee belonging. But now, instead of offering security, these defenses begin to suffocate. The curious thing is that the more the persona cracks, the more perception expands, paving the way for a type of vision that goes beyond the surface, a vision that will be inevitable in the next stage, where seeing too much becomes as uncomfortable as it is liberating. When the persona begins to crack, something curious happens. Inner vision expands. It's not a superpower, it's not mediumship, it's not delusion. It's simply what happens when the inner theater begins to crumble. The person begins to see beyond the surface of things, and this can be as enlightening as it is uncomfortable. Carl Jung explained this phenomenon as an inevitable part of individuation. When the individual is no longer occupied with maintaining masks, there is energy left to perceive what has always been there, but which the ego hid. Suddenly, intentions become evident, emotional nuances leap to the forefront. They perceive what is not said, what is feigned, what is swept under the rug. It's as if life gains a clearer way of seeing, revealing emotional details hidden in people's expressions, in silences, in habits. Spirituality, when active, amplifies this sensitivity, showing layers of meaning that previously went unnoticed. But seeing too much is unsettling, because the person doesn't just see others, they see themselves with the same clarity. And it is precisely at this point that the real discomfort begins. The perception that was previously selective now becomes total. And this forces a review of everything that was previously accepted without question. This kind of inner clarity creates a strange estrangement in ordinary environments. The person looks at superficial conversations and feels a kind of distance, as if watching a choreography repeated millions of times. They sense that some smiles are too polite, some acts of kindness too calculated, some words too empty. None of this is arrogance. It's the inevitable effect of the dissolving ego, when consciousness ceases to be content with appearances and begins to seek substance. Perception becomes so sharp that it recognizes patterns of manipulation, emotional dependence, self-pity, and insecurity that previously seemed invisible. And this applies to oneself as well. One notices one's own defenses, one's own escapes, one's own fears. Many people report that at this stage they become more selective, quieter, more introspective, not because they've lost interest in the world, but because they now perceive too much to pretend otherwise. Simple practices help organize this perceptual avalanche, writing down what you truly saw in a dialogue, observing your own body when something doesn't feel right, or even noting repetitive patterns that appear in interactions. This creates a powerful emotional map, but a map that inevitably reveals deep fears, especially the fear of changing too quickly. Over time, this ability to see beyond the surface ceases to be optional. It becomes part of one's way of being. And this, while a tremendous spiritual advancement, provokes a silent unease. Am I becoming too sensitive? Am I exaggerating? Am I distancing myself from the world? This doubt arises because the external world rarely keeps pace with internal transformations. The person perceives, with a mixture of clarity and discomfort, that what once seemed normal now sounds artificial. They see conversations as mechanisms. They see behaviors as defenses. They see relationships as symbolic exchanges. And this profound vision, so typical of someone going through an archetypal crisis, reinforces the feeling that the old self is dying and something new is taking shape. Spirituality opens this portal, and life responds by revealing layers that can no longer be ignored. But this clarity hurts, because by seeing too much, the person begins to realize that they have changed. And real changes often generate fear. And this silent fear, hidden behind lucidity itself, is exactly what begins to emerge in the next cycle of the journey. When one's vision begins to deepen and the old life loses its place, an almost childlike yet very real fear arises, the fear of changing too much. The person feels this as a subtle tightness in the chest, a silent anxiety that appears at the most unlikely times, before sleeping, in the shower, while driving, or even in the middle of a conversation that no longer makes sense. Carl Jung said that this fear is the natural reflection of the dissolving ego because the old identity struggles to preserve what remains of it. Spirituality addresses this point surgically. It deconstructs, reorganizes, realigns, and each step of this process shakes the emotional structure that has sustained the person for years. It's not uncommon for the thought to arise, will I lose who I was? Or, am I going too far? This apprehension arises because the mind associates profound change with a loss of stability. But ironically, it is this instability that prepares the ground for what truly matters. The archetypal crisis manifests as an internal push away from the known, and the known, even when it no longer makes sense, seems safe. But the real discomfort lies not in the change itself, but in the attempt to continue clinging to a version that no longer exists. This fear intensifies when a person realizes their tastes are changing, their opinions are transforming, their boundaries are becoming firmer. They look at themselves with strangeness and think, I wasn't like this. And indeed, they weren't. They are ceasing to be who they needed to be to survive emotionally, socially, or spiritually until now. When the collapse of the persona happens, it doesn't destroy, it liberates. But the ego interprets it as a threat and reacts. The reaction can come in the form of anxiety, excessive doubts, a desire to go back, nostalgia for old versions that, deep down, only existed to fulfill others' expectations. This discomfort is almost a trial by fire, the soul advancing, the ego resisting, and the consciousness trying to reconcile the two worlds. In moments like these, it's worth practicing small acts of courage, saying no in situations where you would previously say yes, taking an intentional rest when the internal chaos is screaming, or even starting a simple new habit, like meditating for 3 minutes, to remind the body that change can also be safety. Small decisions reaffirm that change is not destroying the person, but rebuilding their inner space. And the more they allow themselves to move forward, the clearer it becomes that this restlessness is not a step backward, it is a harbinger of rebirth. Over time, fear ceases to be just fear and becomes a kind of signal. It appears every time something new is about to be born. It's as if the soul was saying, keep going even if you're trembling. Spirituality works like that. It doesn't give guarantees, it gives direction. When a person approaches the death of the ego, everything that was familiar seems to dissolve, and this feeling of dissolution is precisely what is frightening. But it's frightening because it's real. No one fears what doesn't transform. What is frightening is knowing silently that it's no longer possible to return to the old self. Individuation demands this uncomfortable journey, and there are no shortcuts. It's natural to feel that you're going too fast, that you're risking too much, that you're distancing yourself from the world. But distancing yourself isn't isolation, it's preparation. Those who go through this realize that soon after the fear comes a deep emptiness, an inner silence that doesn't seem like punishment but a transition. And this silence is the inevitable prelude to the next stage, where the ego truly begins to die, not as loss, but as liberation. There comes a point in the journey when a person realizes that something very deep within them has begun to die. And contrary to what the name suggests, this death makes no noise at all. It's a silent transition, like melting snow in the sun, almost imperceptible at first, but impossible to ignore once it's fully established. Carl Jung called this the most delicate point in the individuation process, the phase in which the ego, tired of sustaining itself on artificial versions, begins to give way, piece by piece. The person feels this as an emptiness. It's not sadness, it's not apathy, but a feeling that the old self is saying goodbye. They try to rediscover enthusiasm in things that once consumed them, hobbies, conversations, expectations, and everything sounds distant, like a faded echo. Spirituality often intensifies this transition, bringing a kind of lucidity that can no longer be switched off. The ego, realizing it is losing ground, tries to react with fear, confusion, or nostalgia, but none of these strategies work for very long. The archetypal crisis continues to advance, dismantling old beliefs and making room for something more whole. The person begins to realize that they haven't lost the meaning of life. They've only lost the need to live with borrowed meanings. The death of the ego doesn't happen all at once. It happens in slices. The person realizes they no longer need to prove anything to anyone, no longer need to impress, no longer need to win imaginary battles. Things that were once urgent now seem irrelevant. It's as if the inner world has pressed a psychological detox button, gradually eliminating everything sustained by fear, comparison, jealousy, or the need for approval. This silent collapse causes a feeling of emptiness, an emptiness that many mistake for failure, when in fact it's the exact opposite. This emptiness is space. It's fertile ground. It's the interval between the old skin and the new. Carl Jung described this as the crossing between two worlds, where the individual is no longer who they were, but doesn't yet know who they will be. At this stage, simple practices help navigate the discomfort. Walking in silence, recording dreams, making loose notes, reading authors who speak of profound transformation, such as Viktor Frankl and Clarice Lispector, or even reorganizing one's own room to symbolize this inner cleansing. Small gestures help the conscious mind to keep up with what the unconscious is already doing. And little by little, the old self crumbles with an elegance that the rational mind cannot explain. But the most curious detail of this phase is the following. Although it seems that the person is losing something, in reality they are gaining. They are recovering strength, essence, presence. The ego has always occupied too much space, and when it begins to die, the self can finally breathe. However, this inner expansion happens at such a discreet pace that at first glance, it seems like absence. It is common for the person to feel empty, silent, distant, as if they were walking down a long white corridor without knowing what lies behind the next door. But this corridor is not punishment. It is preparation. Spirituality does this. First, it dismantles, then it reorganizes. And in the middle of this process, everything seems gray. The world loses color, stimuli lose weight, conversations lose their brilliance. But it is precisely in this grayness that the soul finds space to be reborn. The passage to the next stage arises from this emptying, a point where external life becomes colorless, while internal life silently begins to light up with new lights. As soon as the ego enters its final phase of dissolution, the external world undergoes a subtle yet overwhelming phenomenon. It loses its color. Things are still there, but they seem less vibrant, as if someone had removed some shades from the emotional palette of existence. Conversations become more neutral, routines quieter, old desires more opaque. Carl Jung said that this moment marks the beginning of the true spiritual journey, when outer life loses its shine, not because the person is broken, but because inner light is about to be born. It's as if the senses are being recalibrated for a new type of perception. The archetypal crisis that began long ago now becomes a kind of deep cleansing, removing excesses, dissolving noise, silencing stimuli that previously distracted. The soul begins to gain color precisely when the world loses it, because the energy that was previously directed outward returns to the center, and this return creates a strange sensation. On the outside, everything seems gray. On the inside, something discreet, almost timid, begins to pulsate with increasing intensity. This gray period is for many the most confusing. The person feels that nothing excites them as before, not because they are demotivated, but because they are in transition. Like someone moving house and spending days without furniture, they are in a between worlds. They have left an old version behind, but the new one is still being built. Spirituality acts as an organizing force, pulling internal threads, reorganizing memories, revealing old patterns, and giving shape to the first seeds of a new way of living. It's common for the person to feel the urge to isolate themselves, as if the external grayness offered a kind of symbolic protection. They may even find this quieter version of themselves strange, but this silence is fundamental. It is in it that the soul begins to gain color again. Small practices help in this phase. Cooking in silence, walking without headphones, lighting a candle before bed, writing a line a day about what is being reborn. These are simple, almost childlike rituals, but they send the unconscious message that there is space for the new life to emerge. And this new life has its own color, a color that no old persona could ever sustain. Gradually, the person notices something surprising. Color returns, but not from the outside. It returns from within. They begin to feel presence where before there was haste. They begin to find meaning where before there was obligation. They begin to perceive nuances where before there was only routine. It's as if the soul is gaining contrast, depth, texture. This inner rebirth doesn't appear suddenly. It trickles down like water seeping into dry ground until it forms new roots. And these roots are born from the space left by the death of the ego, which opened up within the person a fertile territory for real transformations. The external world may continue to seem simple, monotonous, or even uninteresting, but the inner perception begins to expand, and this expansion is the true sign that the individuation process is consolidating. Still, something is missing. Something the person feels but cannot name. A kind of longing for their own center, a call to return to a more intimate truth. It is this call that inaugurates the next stage, the return to the self, the silent and ancestral sensation of finally returning home. When a person emerges from the grayness and begins to notice that their soul is taking shape again, something profound happens, a kind of inner recognition. It's like rediscovering someone who has always been there, but who was buried for years by social roles, external expectations, and inherited narratives. Carl Jung called this stage a return to the self, the point in the journey where the individual ceases to be confused by their own history and begins to perceive the essence behind everything. Spirituality manifests itself in a more stable, less dramatic, almost serene way, as if a silent compass has finally been activated. The person feels that previously chaotic thoughts begin to align, that previously stormy emotions begin to be understood, that intuition, previously stifled, speaks clearly again. It's not instant enlightenment, it's a gradual return. A return that doesn't require effort, but presence. They are not becoming another person. They are returning to who they always were, before the fears, before the ego, before the persona they needed to build to survive. And this inner recognition ignites a light that no external validation can extinguish. This return to the center brings with it an almost physical feeling of alignment. Things settle down, choices become clearer, unnecessary burdens dissolve. The person realizes they are beginning to act less out of obligation and more out of congruence, less out of fear and more out of authenticity. Relationships reorganize around them, not because they force them, but because their new inner vibration no longer sustains old imbalances. This is one of the clearest signs that the archetypal crisis has fulfilled its role. It destroyed what needed to be destroyed and revealed what was essential. The ego, now weakened after its long dissolution, makes room for deeper choices, more aligned with the self. Spirituality ceases to be an escape and becomes guidance. The person realizes they no longer need to fight against the world because now they walk with a strength that comes from within. Small practices gain value. Waking up 5 minutes earlier just to breathe, reorganizing small spaces in the house, making choices that seem small but carry great symbolism. This is how the self returns, in discreet but non-negotiable gestures, and each gesture reveals a piece of the new life that is emerging. The most beautiful part of this stage is realizing that the feeling of being lost disappears, not because the path has become easier, but because the person finally understands that they were never lost. They were simply stumbling over versions of themselves that no longer belonged to them. This return to the self brings a silent, profound, almost ancestral peace. The person feels they have recovered an inner axis, a kind of spiritual gravity that keeps them stable even in storms. The external world remains the same, but they no longer react as before. They react from a more whole, more lucid, more connected place. This is the point that Jung described as the beginning of true psychological maturity, when the individual no longer lives as an extension of others, but as a legitimate expression of themselves. There are still challenges, of course. The journey doesn't end here, but something has definitely realigned. And this feeling of coming home is the perfect link to the closing of the cycle, the moment when the person realizes that everything that seemed like chaos was, in fact, preparation. A preparation that now opens space to integrate everything, transform everything, and begin to live with a completely new presence. At the end of this journey, the question that echoes within you is not, "What is happening to me?" but rather, "What am I being called to become?" Because now you understand. Nothing you felt was failure, nothing was weakness, nothing was delusion. Each phase, the estrangement, the grayness, the silence, the rupture, was an invitation, an intimate call to return to the center, to breathe with your own soul, to release everything that has aged within you. So I ask you, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to ignore the change and continue living in the version that exhausts you? Or are you going to embrace this process and finally allow your life to reflect who you truly are? The world changes when you change, but the first change always begins within. If this video opened any doors for you, if something made sense, if some internal piece shifted, share it in the comments. I want to know what awakened you, what hurt, what you realized. This interaction isn't just engagement, it's part of your own integration. And if you want to continue understanding your mind, your subconscious, and your awakening process with depth and truth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We still have a long way to go together. The journey has only just begun.